The world economy braces for impact as Donald Trump takes office on Monday. The president-elect's pick for Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, spelled out the new administration's economic plans at his Senate hearing, backing lower taxes, higher tariffs, and the independence of the Federal Reserve. Carsten Brzeski is an economist at ING. Carsten, Bessent seemed to endorse a pretty transactional approach to tariffs, using them to get China to buy more US products, for example. How do you think that might play out in practice?
Yeah, it's indeed interesting that he returns now with this transactional deal basis. How will it play out? In all honesty, I think there is less room for transaction than in the past. What we will see is that Trump and the Trump administration need some revenues in order to finance their budget. So we will get some compromises, but in general, I'm rather prepared to see really the US imposing tariffs on China, imposing tariffs on the EU, and probably then China and the EU in the course of the year also retaliating.
In his first term, of course, China and the EU did avoid some of those tariffs by promising to buy more US imports of various types. Do you think then that that just won't work this time?
Not as good as it did 8 or 7 years ago, because I think back then the Trump administration was maybe not that experienced, sometimes a bit naive. Just look back at Europe, for example, promised to buy soybeans and a bit of LNG, and there was enough to avoid tariffs on European automotives. So I don't think that Europe or China will get away that easily this time around. So it will be tougher negotiations. I think in the case of Europe, what I could see is if Europe promises to step up defense spending, and part of this defense spending goes to the US, that this might be a base for a compromise.
What happens to Europe then if China responds with its own tariffs, some of its cheaper exports end up in Europe, and the Europeans are forced to pick a side?
Very good question. I think, first of all, that's already what we're seeing. I think China will use its overcapacities, as they're called, to go more towards the EU. It will kind of face already increased protectionism in Europe anyhow, especially when it comes to higher quality industrial goods like cars, for example. But China will make an attempt to use the old export model and get into the EU. The EU will respond with protectionism. And I think that's a very good or possible scenario, if the US then really asks the EU to choose. Which side are you on? The American side or the Chinese side? The EU will eventually choose the US side.
What's this going to mean, though, for the European economy, which looks vulnerable already?
The EU economy is much more vulnerable than 8 years ago when we had the start of the first term of Donald Trump. So we are already in this kind of anemic growth scenario for Europe. If we get these tariffs now, this will clearly add to the risks and to the downside factors for the European economy. But I think that's not even everything. You talked about Bessent, and I think what is even more dangerous for the European economy than tariffs are the tax cuts in the US, deregulation in the US, already lower energy prices in the US. So the US economy, in relative terms, will become more attractive than the European economy, which could then mean that investments will be further moved out from the EU to the US, which would then in turn undermine the structural strength of the European economy.
Is there anything that policymakers or the ECB can do to respond to that?
Oh, there's a lot we can do in Europe, but I wouldn't call it response. I think that would be the biggest mistake. So the EU should not wait for the US administration to do something and then respond to it. The EU needs its own plan. And we have this plan, and it's called the Draghi Report from last fall. So what Europe needs to do is to focus on its domestic policy agenda. That is, more investments, big scale, more investments in infrastructure, in education, in digitalization, and at the same time, accelerate reforms, accelerate integration. So if the EU was to start with these things and not wait for Donald Trump and the US administration, that would be a very good advice for the EU.
That was Carsten Brzeski of ING. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.